Good morning, everybody, and welcome, and especially welcome to Michael Barrett, who is joining us again from Pretoria. He spoke to us 2 weeks ago, and that talk has subsequently had many hits. People are extremely interested in the topic, and I think they will be as interested in this morning's presentation, which is to focus on the musical aspects of what makes a really good conductor and a good choir. As I mentioned in the previous introduction, Michael is a senior lecturer in choral conducting at the University of Pretoria. He is currently the conductor of the UP Camerata, but he has conducted many other choirs before. He composes choir music, he arranges choir music, he's a researcher, and in that regard, I would like to tell you of a special award that he has just received since doing the previous presentation for us. He has been given an Exceptional Young Researcher Award by the University of Pretoria for his contributions to academia. And that is something really significant. Michael, we are honored that you prepared to give us a second talk this morning, and we're very much looking forward to it.
Thank you, Prof. Van Niekerk, and good morning, everybody. It's nice to do these Zoom lectures and workshops where I get to say good morning and we're pretty much all in the same time zone. I just presented at the American Choral Directors Association on Saturday, and that's 15,000 conductors and singers and composers from all over the world. It's just really nice to be able to say good morning and we all have the same morning, and what wonderful weather we're having here in Pretoria at the moment. Thank you for joining me today, and it's wonderful to continue this discussion on outstanding choral music. In the first part, we obviously spoke more about, posing philosophical questions in that. And in that, I'd like to link this with a personal philosophy before we go on. I want you to ponder the following scenario. Is very, very common. It's actually just happened quite recently with colleagues that I know because of the COVID pandemic, and it's happened quite a lot at schools throughout South Africa, not just in our field, but obviously in all fields where people have been retrenched and we've had to make certain changes and adaptations due to economic and financial situations. And this is a real scenario, and I want you to consider this before we continue the discussion, which actually leads to the discussion on choral music excellence. So a school has 3 choirs. They have a chamber choir, which consists of 40 audition singers. These are the best singers in the school, and this choir's main focus is to compete nationally and internationally and give performances of high musical quality. The second choir that the school has is an unauditioned choir, a choir that is there for any student that wants to join, regardless whether they have a good ear or have any kind of ability. It is really just there for people to sing for the love of singing. And this is the largest choir, consisting between 80 and 100 singers. Then you have a third choir, which is your show choir, 16 singers. And the point of this choir is that they get to perform at events to show off the school for marketing purposes. Usually this is the financial group. They bring in a lot of money because of the type of performances that they do, but it's just a small group, 16 select singers, and they generally sing pop music. Now the school has come and said, right, we have to cut one of these 3 groups or 2 of these 3 groups, or you can only keep one. Which one do you keep? Do you keep the unauditioned choir because that's for everybody, so you're providing kind of musical experience for everybody? Do you cut the show choir, the one that brings in money for the school, or do you cut the audition choir of 40 singers, which is really just for the absolute musicians? These are real questions and real things that we have to ponder with, and there is no right or wrong answer. But it leads us to conductors and their focus. Are they focused on education, or are they focused on performance? So if we look at education side, if a choir conductor focuses on education, the benefits of education is that there's more access for students. So if you're a conductor and your main aim is to intrinsically motivate singers or give them all an opportunity, then there is more access for students that are not necessarily the best singers. They have the ability to join choirs where there are less restrictive requirements. Choirs that are focused on education, if we compare university choirs in the States to university choirs here in South Africa. The States is focused more on education because the students that are actually in the choirs, get a degree in choral conducting or singing. So they have more repertoire that they study because they do more programs in a year than a choir like a South African university choir, which does not focus necessarily, or main focus is not on education. Such choirs have more exposure to various types of music and styles and world music and that, because the responsibility of the conductor is to expose them to all types of music, whether it's their strength or not their strength. It also has a collaborative teaching aspect in the sense that the students are part of the process. They get to bring their ideas, they get to voice their concerns, they get to have input in how the music is made or performed. And of course, in education, the focus is on the process rather than the outcome. So it's about every day, what we do on that day, what we learn on that day, how it makes us better on a daily basis. So it's really more about the journey than the destination. In contrast, conductors who focus on performance require strict requirements for their auditions and for their choirs. They only want the cream of the crop. It's high audition choirs, must have good ears, often require extensive choral singing experience in order to be part of this group so that this group can perform at the absolute highest level. Their choirs generally sing better or appear to sing better because they have more polished performances. They spend a longer time on a particular repertoire. Whereas your educational choirs would do lots more repertoires. They require them to memorize music, whereas on education side, we don't necessarily are testing your memory. It is conductor preference when it comes to repertoire. So conductors that are high performance or focus on performance want their choirs to perform music that they're comfortable with. So a conductor that, for example, is not really strong in performing jazz music would not perform jazz with this choir because it's really not in because it's not their strength, and also because if education is not the focus, we don't need to necessarily expose them to jazz music. And this is really important if we look at, for example, the Arte Cafia. One of the criticisms I've had of the Arte Cafia Uploos, which is the biggest, or is one of the biggest national choir competitions we have here in South Africa, is that all the choirs perform pretty much contemporary music. I still would love to go to the Arte Cafia. I mean, there are hundreds of choirs that perform and hear a Bach or a Mozart being performed. And I'm not saying Bach and Mozart is better than contemporary music, but a variety of styles and that would be really important. A conductor or a choir that is focused on performance has a conductor that is focused on instruction. So therefore, it's not a collaborative effort. You pretty much do what you're told because there's a very fast turnaround time and there's very little input from singers and that. So it's all about the instruction that is provided by the conductor. And of course, the focus is on the end, the absolute competition, all the performance. That is ultimately what a performance conductor or a conductor that focuses on performance is about. Regardless whether a choir is focused on education or on performance, there are 5 pillars that are necessary to achieve choral excellence. 5 main pillars. This is really important. This is kind of like a foundation of a house. So a house needs a roof, it needs a wall, it needs a floor, it needs windows, whatever the case might be. A house doesn't need air conditioning necessarily. It doesn't need blinds. It doesn't need Baroque art or whatever the case might be. That's over and above. But for a choir to perform at a level that we require as a basic standard of excellence, these are the 5 aspects that we will discuss today: choral tone, diction, balance and blend, intonation, and precision. So if we look at choral tone, what is choral tone? Choral tone, choir sound, or the sound that the choir makes, is a really important aspect of what we do. And it's quite a preferential thing because no 2 choirs sound the same. There are no 2 choirs in the world that sound the same. So much so that if I listen to, for example, certain conductors conduct certain choirs, if I take, for example, Morten Lauritsen. When Morten Lauritsen used to conduct choirs, I would know without actually knowing he could conduct different choirs, but I would hear his style of music or his influence of his choral tone, his idea, a sound ideal within specific choirs, although of course they would never sound the same. And we have certain agreements as choral conductors about tone production. So although no choirs sound the same, there are certain things that we all agree on, and there are certain things that we don't necessarily have to agree on. The things that we as choir conductors agree on is breathy tone. We do not want a choir to sing with air escaping out of the mouth. Ave Maria. When I was in the Drakensberg Boys Choir, we used to do this very silly exercise. I can say it's silly now because, you know, we progress in life. But we used to have to stand with a candle in front of us, and you have to sing, and if the candle flickered, there was too much air coming out. And it's quite a silly thing to do. The idea is that you have very little air escaping out of your mouth. But breathy tone is caused by the vocal cords not closing or not getting out of the way completely when we're singing. And of course, a mismanagement of the vocal tract, the breath support. We also all agree that in general, your pitches should be in tune. Now, I also have to say that it's very dangerous to say we all agree on this, because there are certain styles and certain cultures and that where intonation or pitches in tune is a relative kind of term. And it's not just, I mean, it's all over. I mean, we often have this thing where we call about African tuning. And you might have heard that before, where, for example, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but if you go to a concert with traditional African choirs, there's no such thing as someone blowing a pitch pipe or giving a note on a piano or that. They pretty much just start singing. It's like this muscle memory that they have, which is unbelievable because it's been ingrained in culture, in African culture, where people just sing for the sake of singing. So pitches in tune might be relative in terms of certain cultures and that, but for the sake of this discussion and that, pitches in tune is really important. So in other words, singing every single note perfectly in the center. And we will talk a little bit about intonation just now, but pitches in tune is also once again relative. Think about a dartboard. You have the little red dots in the middle of your dartboard, which is the maximum points. And if you've played darts before, if you throw it, there's a difference between throwing it right in the center of that red and throwing it still in the red, but it's touching the little silver ring at the bottom. It's far more impressive if it's right in the middle, and there is a difference. Free of tension, we believe as conductors that singing without tension is non-negotiable. It's not only dangerous to sing with tension, but of course it affects the sound. Your singing should always be supported by the breath. This is really important. Think about driving a car without having your foot on the accelerator. There always needs to, there's less control. So there always needs to be air or sound supported by the breath. And another thing that we really, really believe in is that everybody must sing the same vowel at the same time, not different vowels. And this in itself is a conundrum in a country like South Africa, which we'll get to. Preferences. So we've spoken about things that we agree in, but there's certain things where we don't necessarily have to agree in when it comes to producing choral tone. Vibrato. Vibrato is the natural fluctuation of our voices, and vibrato is often used in styles of music to create warmth in singing. I'll give you an example. So I can sing without vibrato. Ave Maria. So you can hear all the pitches are without any kind of vibration in the sound. I can add vibrato by going Ave Maria. So there's a natural kind of vibration that I add to the sound, and that is termed vibrato. It's a natural warming of the sound by fluctuating the pitch. Vibrato is a very small fluctuation between pitch. If it's any bigger, Ave Maria, there's a bigger distance between the tones, and that we call that a tremolo. That's not really what we're talking about. But the amount of vibrato we put into our singing, or whether we use it at all or not use it at all, largely depends on the preference of the conductor. And of course, if a choir has vibrato and another one doesn't have vibrato, it's going to change the choral sound or the production of the sound. American choirs, or actually singers in general that are musically trained, have singing as a subject and have studied music, generally are able to control vibrato better than amateur singers. So choirs, university choirs in South Africa, because our choirs consist of mainly students that love to sing rather than singing students do not necessarily have the ability to control vibrato as well as an American choir that consists mainly of all singers. And that it is really a skill that needs to be mastered. We also in South Africa tend to follow the Scandinavian choral ideal. In other words, we love the more clean, less vibrato kind of sound in our singing. It's kind of a cleaner, more crystal kind of sound, whereas American choirs love vibrato. Now, if we look at African choirs, I'm sure all of you are thinking, but what about the opera African choirs that we hear? Yes, those choirs have huge amounts of vibration in their sounds. But one could argue that that's not necessarily natural vibrato, and that could lean a little bit more on the tremolo side. Vowel color. Vowel color is also really important. In other words, do we sing with light vowels? Do we sing with dark vowels? And you're going to hear some examples after this. Choirs can sing with bright R or dark R. So I can change the sound of Ave Maria. Ave Maria. So all I've done is I've placed the vowels in the front of my mouth. It creates a little bit brighter sound. I can make it darker. Ave Maria. And I can make it darker or lighter, and there's lots of gaps in between. So I can actually literally take it from bright to dark. Watch. Ave Maria. So where I place the sound or where I place the vowel in my mouth is going to create a lighter and a darker side. So it's not a question of singing light and dark. It's where the preference is anywhere in that spectrum that a conductor gets to choose. And there are millions of options for every single vowel. Dynamic extremes. How loud is your loud as a conductor versus my loud? What does forte, which is the Italian term for loud, what is that to you as a conductor, and what is it to another conductor? How far can we stretch the limits of our dynamics depending on the ability of our ensembles? Once again, a choir that is musically strong and has the stamina for singing is able to sing richer and more controlled fortes, healthier fortes than a choir that is maybe an amateur choir. And at the same time, obviously, the size of your choir will also have give you that kind of leniency, how loud you can sing and how soft you want to sing. Style and interpretation, how we interpret music, in other words, our own vision for what the music must convey, and the style that we want to conduct it in is completely different. I mean, we have lots of styles of music, from Baroque music would not sound the same as romantic music, would not sound the same as pop music. And to what extent we use our own creative interpretation to think, I wonder what Bach wanted this cantata to sound like, or I wonder what the Beatles actually meant when we sing Imagine, or whatever the case might be. Use of vocal registers is another thing that we don't necessarily agree with. Vocal registers is our ability to create the sound either in our chest register or our head register, or a mixture of both. For example, if I wanted to sing a note in my chest register, which is my really strong register, it would sound like this. Ave Maria. I can sing those exact pitches in my head register. Ave Maria. It was a little bit of a silly example. I started too low. Usually the head register is a little bit higher. So if I think of it like this, Ave Maria, or in my head register, Ave Maria. So at what extent do I use the chest register, and what extent do I use the head register, and when do I combine the two? Because I can combine the two. For example, I could use a bit of head and a bit of chest. Ave Maria. So there's a combination of head and chest. Do I like to sing everything in the chest voice, or do I like to have a bit of head voice in all of this? And obviously, the way that I create the light sound into the heavy sound, the head into the chest, is going to change the sound, the timbre of the sound. And to what extent do I do this with the altos? To what extent do I do the basses? When do I change over from chest to head? Do I use falsetto? Falsetto is a fake sound. That's when I don't use all of my vocal cords. I only use the inner of my vocal cords, and it sounds very airy, like this. Ave Maria. No chest in that at all. It's my fake voice. It's what the falsettists used, very popular during the late Romantic period. And then, of course, conducting gestures, another thing that we talk about. The way that I stand and communicate in front of my choir using my hands in that is going to create a completely different tone. If I, for example, stand really kind of big like this, and I have my hands in a round kind of gesture like this, I can create a darker kind of sound. My hands are slightly higher up, and I have a upward movement. I'm going to create a different kind of sound. So what I actually do, what they see, is what I'll get. In other words, if I want them to create a dark sound, I have to give them an image of darkness. So your conducting gesture, no conductors conduct the same. You're going to get a completely different style of sound or a tone that is created. And of course, the adolescent voice is something that I just threw in here because I think it's really important. How we deal with the adolescent voice is important. When an adolescent, whether it's a female or a male, goes through vocal changes through the adolescent phases, the voice becomes very difficult. First things first is their voices become very airy, and that's because the vocal cords are developing, but they develop not equally, so they don't always close. And then you get this kind of sound, and especially as boys, you can hear it, and the voice goes up and down, and it's actually called a ball drag, because here the Adam's apple here actually struggles to open and close. It's not controlled. The muscle is uneven, and because of that, it's very difficult for them to create the sound. So the educator, for example, talking about our educators versus our performance conductors, the educator allows this student to sing, but monitors the voice, making sure they don't sing music that's too high or too low, always checking up on them. The performance one probably wouldn't allow them to sing in the choir because it creates that breathy tone, which is ultimately not what we want. So let's have a look at two examples. Throughout this talk, I'm going to keep referring back so you can hear the differences. Here we're going to listen to the St. Jakob Vocal Ensemble from Sweden, singing Bogorodice Dievo by Rachmaninov, just the first part of it. Then we're going to go to a Russian choir that's also going to sing the same piece, and we'll just listen to a snippet of each of them. I want you to listen to how the choral tone in the Swedish choir is much lighter. It's brighter. Bogorodice Dievo. In the Russian choir, Bogorodice Dievo. Much darker. Listen to the crescendos and decrescendos by the Swedish choir, far more reserved, whereas the Russian choir, not so reserved, really big crescendos and decrescendos. And watch the conducting gesture by the Swedish conductor, which is small, and the conducting gesture by the Russian conductor. You're going to get two, and by the way, both of these, there's no right or wrong. These are both outstanding ensembles, world-renowned. But this is to show you how difficult our jobs as conductors are to get the desired choral tone. So here's the first example by St. Jakob Vocal Ensemble. One of the things that upsets me so much, I wouldn't say upsets, but gets me really down, is when I have choir conductors that teaches their choirs to sing without the text. In other words, let's all sing this piece on la 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 because it's the first time we look at it, leave the text out. And that's probably one of the biggest flaws that choir conductors have, because our improved diction, or improving the diction of what we're going to sing, is actually one of the most important ways of us getting good results in our singing, because diction is everything when it comes to music. And Don Collins was the first one to say that improved diction yields the most obvious positive results towards good choral sound. We cannot have good choral sound without diction. So what does diction consist of? Is it just about saying things nicely? It is about so much more than that, and it really has to be practiced with so much discipline and so much focus and concentration on a daily basis. Consonant clarity is, of course, really, really important. Our pronunciation, articulation, and enunciation. Whenever I teach my choral conducting students, I ask them what's the difference between pronunciation and enunciation. They still can't really actually tell me. And I tell them that you can pronounce tomato as in tomato or tomato, but the way that you say it, the way you enunciate it, in other words, the actual inflection of the word and how it is said, is how you enunciate, and it's completely different. So would you, for example, sing Ave Maria, or Ave Maria? So the pronunciation was identical, but the enunciation was different. And the articulation of the consonants, how loud are the consonants versus the vowels. Rhythmic release of consonants. This is something we don't deal with. I suppose we do if we look at Desmond Tutu. Desmond Tutu has, Archbishop Desmond Tutu has a very unique rhythmic release of his consonants. He would say, I am happy to be with you. So his rhythmic release is different to most of us, but you also get the Jenny Cruz Williams of the world that really say, where are we going and what shall we be doing? So the rhythmic release is how long we hold on to our consonants and vowels. And this is obviously significant in choirs, because unlike when we speak freely, Jenny Cruz Williams and Desmond Tutu would not make a good combination if they had to speak together, because the one would be further ahead than the other one. But in choirs, we need it all to be exactly the same. So can you imagine every T, every R, every consonant must be released at exactly the same time? Of course, our breath support also has to do with consonants or clarity of pronunciation. As you run out of breath, think about a car running out of petrol. You start to slow down the continued support of vowels and that. So breath support is another integral aspect to how we pronounce words. Our rhythmic precision, how we move from word to another word. Another very important aspect is if we have diphthongs. That whole sentence from Blowback to Strand is a nightmare, because there's so many diphthongs in there. Do you have the choir sing? Or where do you want them to change? Do you want them to release the diphthong right at the end or in the beginning? Or for example. So where exactly do you want that release of that rhythmic precision in the vowels? And I can tell you, if you have 86 people, this takes a lot of practice, a huge amount of practice. The clarity of the text is important. Do you pronounce H's like Jenny Cruz Williams? Do we sing where are we going, or do we sing where are we going? What is your preference? How do you want to clarify text, and to what extent do you clarify the text so it doesn't interrupt the vocal flow of the music? Because as singers, we are focused consistently on elongating vowels and that. To what extent do we have to sacrifice that elongation so that we can hear the T's and the Q's so people can understand the text? Our word stress inflections and our subtleties of poetic nuance is also so important. Where, for example, do we want the emphasis of the word? I mean, if it's a foreign language, it's really takes a lot more concentration and a lot more study, score study, to be able to say, is it Bogorodice Dievo or Bogorodice Dievo? And is it Dievo or is it Dievo or is it Dievo? Where do we want the word stress, the inflection? How do we study this? And to what extent do we as conductors do that? Of course, we sing, and when we sing on vowels. And because every language is different, we have lots of different vowels. English is a nightmare to sing because we have so many diphthongs and triphthongs, whereas in Italian and Latin, we don't have that at all. And all these things, as I've just said with my example of Hasey, is where do we, for example, release these? I mean, it's these subtleties in our singing, in our language. And all of this is important because it affects our third pillar, which we'll get to in a second. And in a country like South Africa, vowels and pronunciation of diction is so unbelievably important. We have it far more difficult than, for example, our Scandinavian brothers and sisters, because my choir, the Tux Camerata, when I last checked, had 8 of the 11 official languages in it. Everybody pronounces, and of course we have international students. Excuse me. So not everybody speaks the same English. Not everybody pronounces words the same. I mean, you've got Afrikaans people that tend to speak more binnenmonds. They speak inside the mouth, so they naturally have darker vowels. And English people naturally have more forward-speaking vowels because of our language. And then you've got traditional cultures that have it differently. For example, the Sotho languages, they don't have pure vowels like the Nguni languages. So Zulu, Xhosa, Indebele, isiSwati, they have more Latin pronunciation, which is kind of in the middle. And then the Sotho vowels have got a more flatter vowel. Put all of these people together and you ask them to sing any language in the world, becomes very complicated because everybody's now going to release the consonants and the vowels at different stages. They're going to pronounce it differently. It becomes really, really difficult. And that means we have to work a lot harder. The next pillar that we look at is balance and blend. What is balance and what is blend? Balance and blend, there's nothing more beautiful in this world than listening to a choir, sitting back and closing your eyes, and there is this absolutely beautiful blended sound that sounds like one voice. It's the only way that I can explain it. Although you can hear there's harmony in the singing, it sounds like one choir singing, not lots of individuals made up. And a perfect example is if you compare a really good choir, like the 2 we've just played, versus opera choirs. Opera choirs tend to have very powerful voices, and you can kind of pinpoint. If you look when watching an opera choir, you'll be able to pinpoint, oh, I can see that guy that's his voice. I can kind of pinpoint. If you can't do that in a choir, then that's ultimately what we want. We want it to be this beautiful blended sound. So what is blend? Blend consists of 4 things, or achieving good blend has to do with intonation, balance, color, and diction. Intonation is really about good voice leading and the resolution of tension points in the music. In other words, where do you want, it's also about keeping the pitches in tune, but it's also about where do you want the intonation to lead in a particular piece, especially if you're singing polyphonic music. Balance is, like I just explained, you want each voice part or each voice to be blended with another voice part. And this is also really important for the texture of the music. You don't want any single voice standing out. Color, the color is really important. Each voice group, altos will sound, conductor in our ideal world has a specific sound, how we want altos to sound like, versus tenors, versus basses, and versus sopranos. So I'm going to give you an example. Sopranos tend to, because they have higher frequencies. If you have higher frequencies are more audible than lower frequencies. So you might have heard a choir and you think, oh, those sopranos are quite sharp. They've got that sharp sound. That might be because they're not blended very well, or they might have too many sopranos. They might just be top heavy, as they call it, which is quite common because you get more sopranos than you do basses, especially in amateur choirs. So the soprano sound might be very, very piercing in that. So for sopranos, we don't want sopranos to have this really big, powerful sound. We want that kind of boy soprano. Think of a beautiful boy soprano singing like a flute kind of sound. Altos, on the other hand, tend to disappear. The alto is the voice group that disappears the most because they tend to have the most air in their voice. So we want to teach our altos to sing with like a dark chocolatey sound. For example, if I wanted to sing alto, most altos, inexperienced altos, would sound like this. That would be their kind of sound. If I want them to sing dark chocolate, I would think, In doing this, what I do is I manipulate the shape of the vowels. Altos would sing with darker vowels, in other words, more into the mouth, and sopranos would sing with brighter vowels into the front. This naturally will bring the balance and blend more into focus, because then my sopranos naturally will become softer with the brighter vowels, and the altos will become darker. Tenors and basses also have their own sound, and each conductor gets to mold and create these 4 different sounds, or these 4 different ideals. Obviously, in choirs like the Camerata, you have 8 different ideals because you have 8 different voice parts: soprano 1 and soprano 2, alto 1, alto 2, tenor 1, tenor 2, bass 1, and bass 2. And each of these groups will have a specific sound ideal that I want, and I mold them individually. Now, individually, those 8 groups in Camerata have to be able to blend. They must sound like one voice, and they must all have the same ideal. If they're dark chocolate, they must be dark chocolate. If they're flute-like, they must be flute-like. And on top of that, all 8 of these need to work together as well, so that the balance between each of the voice groups is ideal. And of course, diction we've already spoken about, but diction obviously plays a really important point. Think about a overzealous tenor who puts his T's in the wrong places all the time, and you hear these exaggerated consonants all over the place. This, of course, can affect your balance and your blend through language. We've spoken about vibrato, but of course vibrato can disturb balance and blend phenomenally in a choir. And it also affects the intonation. Remember, we spoke vibrato is a natural fluctuation of the pitch. If there's a singer, and I've had this many times, that has these natural big vibratos which they struggle to control, that would be very difficult to blend within a choir. It's very, very difficult to blend. It's a difficult thing to teach. When I was in Pretoria High School for Girls, there was a famous opera singer, or a famous student at that stage, who's now become a very well-known opera singer, Megan Katz. And she sang in my choir, and she was a phenomenal singer. Funny enough, the best singer the choir had, and probably ever had since I was there. Yet it was difficult to have her in the choir because her voice was too big. And at that stage, she didn't understand how to blend into a bigger picture in that. And that disturbed the balance and the blend of the choir, ironically, because she was the best singer in the choir. Now, on top of all of this, everything is on top of everything, you have different voice types. So voice types can be classified into 3 main groups: flute, brass, or reed. And then, of course, you get combinations: flute, reed, reed, brass, flute, brass, whatever the case might be. And these voice types, or identifying these voice types in a choir, are really important. For example, a boy soprano, that really nice sound, if you think of Liberal, the Drakensberg Boys Choir, or any boy that has a boy soprano, they've got that very beautiful flute sound. It's got no air in it, and it's crystal clear and perfect. That's a flute type voice. And it's not just sopranos, all voices can have it. It's that really beautiful lyrical sound that you get. A reed voice is natural. It's the alto sound that you get that has a lot of air in it. So it's a nice sound, but there's obviously always this air escaping. It's usually adolescent voices. And then you get a brass sound. That's that singer, usually a baritone sound, but you get it in all voice groups. It's got that very pushy kind of sound. Ave Maria. Very brassy, very pushed kind of sound. And of course, you get combinations of each: reed, flute, and all of these. And identifying these voices is very important, because through experience, you can blend. All choirs will consist of all of these. This is really important. If I do auditions, I need all of these voice types in order to form a perfect, beautiful balance. You need the flute soprano, you need the brass, you need the reed, and the combinations. But by understanding them and understanding the voices and who has them, I can blend them by where I seat them. In other words, if I have, for example, a brass voice, a baritone, and in between the 2 baritones, I can have 2 reed voices, or the brass voice, a baritone. On either side of him, if I have 2 voices that have got more reed-like, that air absorbs the sound from the brass and actually makes him disappear. It's the most fantastic thing. My choir loves it when I do these exercises. I have the choir stand in lines, and I literally test each singer one by one, and then I move the voices so that I can have those strong voices blended by those airy sounds. Obviously, your stronger voices, like your brass voices, just like in an orchestra, are placed further back in the choir, and the lighter voices, your flute kind of voices, would be more to the front of the choir sound. Think about it in terms of stereophonic. You want the stronger boomy kind of sound at the back and in the center, and then you kind of fan it out to lighter voices. All of this will affect the balance and blend in your choir. And the more you focus on this as conductors, obviously the better results. And of course, acoustics affects sound greatly. You get two main types of acoustics, dry and wet. Dry acoustics, the driest acoustic that you can get is to sing outside. In other words, the sound does not bounce back, doesn't reverberate at all. It just goes into the heavens, disappears, and never comes back. And of course, the wettest acoustic you have would be a small cathedral that is completely marbled, or your bathroom. Bathroom is a great idea. Close the door to your bathroom. That's why we always sing in the shower, because voice sounds so fantastic in the shower. So in other words, the sound bounces back because it hits the solid and it comes directly back. The smaller the venue, the quicker you get your response, because sound travels and it obviously hits something and it comes back. So your wet acoustics are where you sing in a cathedral-like setting where the sound comes back, because the sound doesn't stop while you're singing, and it creates kind of like this continuous mush. It's sound on top of sound, and all choirs sound fantastic in these acoustics because it's just this kind of it's this beautiful blended kind of molded sound. It just never stops. And wet acoustics cover mistakes, all kinds of mistakes. So it's wonderful to sing in them. Dry acoustics, unfortunately, you can't handle dry acoustics. You'll hear every single mistake. Choirs struggle because they can't hear each other. So it becomes very difficult for them to intonate. There are many aspects of dry acoustics that's difficult. Of course, wet acoustics is also not the best because you can't perform all styles of music. You can't, for example, perform fast music in a wet acoustic because the sound never stops. So it just becomes kind of messy. So you want kind of like a middle point for both. And that's why you have concert venues. Concert venues try to create sound ideals that is very, very good for singers. So if we look at the University of Pretoria, if any of you have been there, we have the aula, and we have the chapel, the UP chapel, and we have the museum. The chapel is a wet acoustic, so it has more reverberant sound than any of the other two venues. So if we want to sing in the chapel, we sing slow, beautiful hymn-like songs, church kind of music. If we go to the aula, it's as dry as anything. Even though they've said 1,000 times, we've made the acoustic so wonderful, the aula has the worst acoustic in the world. And I'm saying that because it's so true. It is so difficult to sing in there. It's very difficult for choirs. You cannot hear, the sound literally falls into the first row, so nobody in the rest of the aula, which takes 1,000 people, can hear it. And then you have the museum, which is absolutely perfect for choirs because it's the right amount of wet and dry acoustics. We can hear each other nicely and the sound carries perfectly. So of course, size of venue also plays a role. The museum's only a 500-seater, whereas the aula is a 1,000-seater. The chapel's 300 seats. And also something else about acoustics. Oh, of course, and like the aula wasn't built for camerata, it was built for show. So having the orchestra play in there is a little bit better for them than for us. But to have, like, for example, a rock concert in the aula would be fantastic because, you know, you need dry acoustics for aspects such as that. So now let's listen to how these choirs focusing on diction and balance and blend continue with the Rachmaninov Bogorodice Dievo. Now let's listen to the Russian choir sing the same part of Rachmaninoff's Bogorodice Dievo, Ave Maria. something really beautiful about the traditions of the Russian singing. The fourth pillar, which is the bane of our existence as conductors, is intonation. Now, I want to tell you what you eat, what you're thinking, what your wife or your significant other said to you on the day, the weather, the acoustic, if you've got snot in your nose or not, is going to affect your intonation. And can you imagine having 86 people standing in front of you and they all have their own problems? Intonation is truly the most difficult part of our art. And it consists mainly of two things. What is intonation? Intonation is more than just tuning or singing the notes. It is actually the realization by your singers of how accurate they sing that note, the bull dart, bullseye. Is it right in the center? Is it on the edge? What is the case might be? And it is the single note that they sing, but it's also their note and how it fits to every other note that's being sung by every other voice group or instrument in that. So intonation is really about producing tones or the notes that we sing correctly, obviously supported by the breath, but it's more important that it is our actual degree of tonal awareness by the individual singer. In other words, I can sing a note in tune and I can sing a note really in tune. Now, this is such an interesting point. We have things like micro-intonation, which conductors that focus really on that center of the bullseye. For me, it's not enough that you got the same amount of points by throwing the bull dart and it hits the silver edge. It's still in the red of the dartboard, but it's touching the silver. That to me is not as impressive as it being right in the middle. It has to be equidistant. The radius between every single point in that circle must be precise. The harder we work on that, the better. Intonation is a pivotal characteristic of musicianship, and the best choirs in the world can sing perfectly in tune without any instrumental accompaniment or help. In other words, a cappella. Sorry, now because you've shared the screen, I have to go out here again. There we go. So if we look at intonation, intonation can be tonal and non-tonal. In other words, these are all the factors that can distract from your choir being at the top of their game. Tonal have to do with the actual music, in other words, the sounding. So for example, if you use a piano is not tuned, this is obviously very scientific, but a piano is not tuned to the natural order of the world or to the overtone series that is created by Mother Nature, if we can put it that way. A piano is mechanically tuned, so every distance from each note is equidistant apart. But the balance of chords in nature doesn't work like that. So if a choir is singing without the piano, they sing more in tune than if they sing with the piano. And this is really important. If you look at an orchestra, orchestras, when they tune to the circle of fifths. In other words, every 5 notes apart. When a piano is tuned, it's tuned obviously in the same way, but each note has got its equidistance. It's called equal temperament. Whereas in an orchestra, if the orchestra has to play with a pianist, if they're doing a piano concerto, they have to tune to the piano because the piano is in a different key to what they would be if they were tuning without. And choirs work exactly in the same way. Intervals, for example, if we sing certain intervals in music, singing intervals of fifths, open fifths from do to so, do, so is really important for a tuning point of view. If we sing repeated notes, I want to sing today, I want to sing. If we sing repeated notes, every repeated note that you sing actually has to be thought higher than the previous note. Because when we sing repeated notes, we naturally detonate. We sing lower for each note. This is about the mental acute awareness when we sing. And when we sing in our passaggio, we have a chest voice and we have a head voice that I spoke about earlier. And in between these two, we have a passage, a passaggio. That passage is the most difficult part in our voices because it's where the change happens. And most singers sing badly or struggle to sing through their passaggio, and that affects the intonation. So when we're aware that these few notes in our range is difficult to intonate, if I understand that, I can possibly make sure my intonation is not bad. And there's many examples of such tonal things. Non-tonal things, in other words, things that are nothing to do with actual making noise, can also affect intonation, like poor acoustics. I just said, singing in the aula, the choir is going to sing really badly. Singing in the chapel, the choir will also sing badly because if we can't constantly hear where our pitch is because we've got this wet sound the whole time, it's difficult to intonate as well. So we will tend to sing flatter than what we would want to. If we sing the Messiah, it's much easier to hear. If it's hot outside, really hot outside, choirs tend to sing flat. If it's cold, choirs tend to sing sharp because our bodies are trying to keep us warm, so we have faster heartbeats or whatever the case might be. There are many reasons, and of course the heat makes us very lethargic, and when we're lethargic we don't focus as much. Fatigue, being tired, being frustrated. Music that's really fast can push intonation higher, and music that's very slow can make it go down. If we're bored, conductors can make us sing out of tune. If we have the wrong vowels, and one of the biggest evils is when we don't really know the music. If we don't know the music, I mean, besides the fact that we sing the wrong notes, it obviously leads to very bad intonation. And the final pillar that we have is based on 3 basic principles. And one thing I want to point out to you here is, as a pianist, as a violinist, as a singer, from the get-go, from day one, you go to your practice room, whether you play the piano, violin, or sing, and from day one, you put your fingers to the key. You start your art form, muscle memory from beginning. Conductors don't work like this. I've just spoken about 4 massive pillars, and only now do we get to the stage where we actually start to craft. Conductors have a very, very long road to getting to this point where we actually get to mold the music in our art form by conducting gesture or through conducting gesture. We need a huge amount of back knowledge because we're educating other people. Whereas a pianist who sits down at piano is educating himself. A violinist educates themselves. They don't have to pass on this knowledge. But in our goal, we have 4 massive steps before this where we have to make 86 different people do the same thing by giving them different tools into doing it, making it a really far superior art form. Working on the emotions of people. So the 3 basic principles that we have here in terms of gesture is how we start together, how we stay together, and how we end together. And the only way we know this or get to this stage is by truly knowing the score. So I'm literally gesturing someone to come over. I can literally physically ask them to come towards me. In the same way, I can take the same gesture, turn my hand the other way around, and tell them to go away. Now, one of the art forms that we're trying to understand or to explain to students is often when we conduct, we give mixed signals. We tell people to come or we tell them to go at the same time. That's ultimately what we want to avoid with conducting. So practicing our gesture where we want them to breathe all at exactly the same time, where we want them to stay, where we want them to change the vowel in a diphthong at exactly the precise moment, where we want the T to be. Do we want the sound to be heavy in the altos while it's lighter in the sopranos? Do we want there to be massive crescendos, and how do they all crescendo at the same time? What is the picture we want them to create? Do we want them to think about the light shining in? How hot is that light? When we sing Luxa Rumque, how do we see that shimmer in the light so that the audience, when they listen to it, they want to turn away because there's the brightness in their eye? How do we get this kind of communication through our conducting gesture? And of course, simple things like ending consonants at the end, intonation, how we lift intonation at the ends of phrases. All of this is about the precision of the conducting, and is only achieved through his gesture. So what makes an outstanding choir? What is outstanding choral music? What does it all boil down to? Communication. It is the ability of the conductor to take the wishes of the composer, the artistic creation that was created through the conductor, passed on to the performers and onto the audience so that they all get the same picture, the same ideal. It is our vision to be able to create something through a long line. It's like playing broken telephone without it breaking. If the sound coming back to us is not what we want, then we must be willing to accept that it's a sound mirror of our conducting. We need to change, we need to adapt. If I don't like the sound, it's because of me as a conductor. Ultimately, the sounds of the conductor and the chorus will become commentary of their ability to transfer their knowledge, to enlarge and refine their pedagogical techniques, to arouse and maintain dedication to vocal and musical disciplines on the part of the singers, to shape the syllabic and melodic nuances, to expand the knowledge and technical proficiency of the chorus, and to lead the group to artistic performances. In other words, to have 5 pillars balanced all the time and continuously molding these pillars so that they can reach the ultimate success. So achieving excellence is our ability to use tools to, in other words, using tools that we have to create a vision, to get the singers to be able to sing beautifully, the ability to direct and explain through verbalization, our effective gesturing, how on stage we create what we have taught, and of course, how creative we are at interpreting the music, creating something new. Does it sound the same? These 2 beautiful versions of Bogadadite Diebo, both performed beautifully, interpreted completely differently. So the excellence, or the excellent conductor, the one that achieves excellence, or choirs that are of core excellence, are people that are able to interpret the music, to be able to create a new, fresh idea. Conductors are teachers of skills. We are there to impart knowledge onto our singers, because the more knowledge we impart onto our singers, whether you're a performance choir or an education choir, you're always learning. The more they learn, the better they become. It's our job to organize experiences for them so that they stay, they become intrinsically involved and stay for the music. It's a passion and a desire that we want. Craig Heller-Johnson is one of my favorite conductors, and he says that his goal with his choir is to get the music outside of each person, to really draw out the musicality. And the true conductor is a lifelong learner, one that continues to improve his craft. And of course, all conductors that really are good at what they do are sensitive human beings. We listen, we have people that have needs, people that have emotions. And as I've always said, there are no such things as bad choirs, only bad conductors. So ultimately, what is choral excellence? Choral excellence is the conductor's ability to always improve, to always learn more, and to impart knowledge to the finest detail to their singers. I've always believed that the best choirs in the world have conductors that are not necessarily the most talented, but work the hardest. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for a wonderful presentation. Can we give a chance now for people to ask questions, please?
Sure.
Michael Gert here. Close harmony, that must take a lot of practice to have that perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. So close harmony is when, obviously, as the word says, the closer you get to the notes, the more difficult it is to get. When we start singing, we obviously teach everybody first to sing in unison. In other words, everybody sings the same note. And then, of course, we start singing basic harmonies. In other words, the triads, the tonic, the dominant, do, mi, so, putting those together because our ears, especially Western ears, are quite natural to hear that tuning. And as the notes get kind of closer together, in other words, you add dissonance, a second or a fifth, where the music becomes what I call schmaltzy. That, of course, is the next step. That becomes more difficult from an intonation point of view. And one of the reasons for that is, which is quite interesting, is that choirs tend to gravitate, especially inexperienced ears, they tend to gravitate to what they know. So if they know a chord, do, mi, so, and you've got dissonance, they tend to try gravitate to either one of the notes above or below. It's really quite an interesting thing. Another perfect example is teaching amateur choirs to sing a minor third, strangely, or a minor third in a chord is very difficult. They tend to sing the major the whole time because their ears are not used to singing minor and that, so they will adapt and change. That obviously is an art form. And then, of course, the final step is to teach them complete dissonance. In other words, where the music makes absolutely no sense, because then they really have to use their brains, because then they cannot actually relate the music to anything like a tonic chord or that. So yes, that takes a huge amount of discipline and takes a huge amount of time, but it's baby steps. So I would, for example, not teach a primary school choir to sing Schönberg or Hendrik Hofmeyr. Obviously, they wouldn't get that right.
Michael, could I tell you that we have a compliment for you from one of our members, Trudy Kuleman. You may not know, but Trudy left South Africa and spent most of her working life in the Netherlands as a singer and then as a conductor of a chamber choir. And if I'm not mistaken, she was even knighted by the Queen in the Netherlands for her services to music there. And she writes in the chat box, "Reg so, Michael, you say it absolutely as it is."
Thanks, Judy. I think Judy knows the heartsore and the tears that we have wept and the bottles of wines we've needed to finish because we go home at nighttime, and this is a true thing. Maybe I always tell my singers I'm a bit of a choir nerd. They ask me what music do I listen to. I say choir music. But I go home after a concert, when we used to have concerts before COVID, or a rehearsal, and my choir would sing out of tune, or it just wasn't the performance that I thought it would be. And I actually beat myself up and I'm like, what have I done wrong? Where have I gone wrong in this teaching process? And in the next concert, everything comes together. There are sometimes things we can control in the music, sometimes we cannot control. And the truth of the matter is, this is for all choirs. One other thing that I would like to tell all the delegates is, and this is absolutely true, there is no such thing as a perfect choir or a perfect performance. There is no such thing. It just does not exist. I mean, there are better performances and ones that have shortcomings, but there is no such thing as a perfect performance. We are always continuing to be better at the next performance. That's ultimately our goal, because you're working with individuals, and to get individuals on the same wavelength for 100% of the time is just not feasible, and it's not possible. And actually, perfect performances, if there was such a thing, I think would become so clinical that it would have less heart, because heart sometimes disturbs the natural order of musicality, our pillars. And I think that's also really important.
Do we have any more questions?
I don't want to ask something. I just want to say thank you for really fascinating insight into the intricacies of what you do. We go along and we are entertained and enriched, and you really have opened my eyes to the difficulties and the intricacies. And thank you so much for this beautiful explanation, and good luck.
Thank you. I want to add just one thing to that. I often do workshops with choir conductors all over the world, and they specifically ask me, a lot of them say to me, how do I get my choir to be so good? And the one thing that I always have to tell them is that I'm in a very fortunate position, and I really mean that. I'm in an absolutely fortunate position where I get paid to sit in my office and focus my entire dedication and life, or most of it at least, towards camerata singing better. Unlike a school choir conductor who has to the whole day teach music or has to do class music or stuff that's not necessarily directly related to the choir, and then in the afternoon has to quickly do a 2-hour choir rehearsal. In between this, still mark all classing, get home, feed, etc. So the amount of time that they get to dedicate on all these aspects that I have, I get to dream, eat, sleep, and focus on this. And that's one of the reasons why I have that ability to take that step higher, is because I'm fortunate enough to be able to spend so much time on it. And I think that's the true essence of what we do. Choral conducting is an art form. It's an absolute profession. It's not a hobby necessarily. In order to be a conductor, you get different kinds of conductors. You get professional conductors, and you get conductors that conduct as a side kind of thing, or as an added benefit. And I think that's also really important. To be at the best of your game takes huge amounts of work and insight. And I mean, this was really a general discussion on choir conducting. There's so much more to this art form that actually goes into the intricacies of what we do. So I've always believed the harder you work, the better the result.
Michael, you talked about diction. Now, so often the words are drowned out by the accompaniment, or they sing in foreign languages. We don't understand the words anyway. And I think very often in my listening experience, I've kind of tuned out of trying to understand what is being sung. So very often the diction is not so important, but the music is very important. What do you say about that?
No, that's absolutely can't be. So if you're drowning out sounds for any other reason because of the nice harmonies that you like, you're missing half of the fun. Remember, choirs are superior in the fact that they can give you a specific message. The rule of thumb is, for example, if we look at Lux Arumque, Light, the Golden Light by Eric Whitaker. It's this beautiful soundscape that's really just about sounds. And of course, if you don't speak Latin, you would need kind of help. And it literally is about the birth of Jesus Christ. And the best choirs in the world, or best conductors in the world, are able to create that light shining so much that you want to turn away from that glare. And they do this through crescendos and decrescendos and that. So you would have a basic kind of, or you'll have the translation in your program, which is necessary. That's why it always upsets me when you go to choir concerts and there's no program. You have to have that program so that when you hear, your brain automatically goes, oh my word, I can hear how the light is coming and going, because I can see in the program notes, this is about the light. It's about the shining of the light. It's about the warmth of the light. And while I'm sitting there, my brain puts two and two together and I get that specific message. I can feel the light in that. And yes, you do get choirs that kind of, they sacrifice the text for the flow of the legato of the vowels and that. The best choir conductors can deal with both. And I think this is a really important technique. It's very difficult to do that.
Michael, if we do not have any more questions, then I would just like to say that I'm sure you're aware of the old adage that those who can do and those who can't teach. And I think what you've emphasized for us today is that you can both do and teach in equal measure. And thank you so much indeed. We much appreciate it.